Today we're going to do Should I Read the Paternus Trilogy by Dyrk Ashton. As always in this series, I am going to be giving us some pros, some cons, and then some idea as to whether I think you should read it or not, what things might make it appeal to you, and what kind of things might put you off getting involved in this series. The Paternus Trilogy is an urban fantasy setting. This follows the main character Fee, or Fiona Megan Patterson, who lives with her uncle Edgar. We follow Fee, her uncle Edgar, and her love interest Zeke as they uncover a world of magic and mystery as it unfolds in front of them. This is a self-published adult urban fantasy series. As it develops through the series, it starts to become more and more epic. We start to step away from the normal urban fantasy setting, but it is very much set in our world. Let's jump into some of the positives and some of the negatives with this series. My first negative for this series is that the first book is definitely the weakest. It is relatively slow, and I found it relatively hard to attach to our characters. So particularly Fee and Zeke, I found it difficult to engage with them, and partially this is down to the amount of time they have on the page. We see a lot of side character perspectives who are elsewhere in the world. Along with that, the style that Ashton has decided to use here does make it a little bit tricky. So it is in the present tense, which is not a big problem. It just took a little bit of time for me to get used to. I'm very much used to reading fantasy books specifically in the past tense. Along with that, it uses a third-person omniscient narrator. And what that means is, instead of us, when we are following Fee, being inside her head completely and seeing everything through her eyes, we're a little bit removed. We actually do see it from a particular character's perspective, but Ashton has this habit of jumping between different characters in the scene, and you getting a couple of sentences from someone's perspective and then a couple of sentences where we see things from another person's perspective, and it means that we don't really have a super deep connection. It doesn't feel like we're along for the ride with our main characters necessarily. That does mean it takes a little bit more time to build up that relationship with our main characters. The flip side of that negative can actually also be very positive in other ways. The positive side of it is that we get to understand our large cast of characters, and we get to understand each of them individually. So instead of only seeing characters through our main character's viewpoint and their eyes, we actually get to hear the thoughts of each character in their own mind in different places. And what that really does is it improves the world building. So I found book one was quite weak in terms of the plot. It felt quite slow, and by the time we got to the end of it, it only really felt like we had hit the inciting incident almost. Whereas what is done really well in book one is the world is built really, really well. We get to understand each of our characters a little bit, but it does damage and detract a little bit from how we engage with our main character, at least how I engaged with the main characters of this book. Another negative for me is at the start of this series, I much preferred the side characters, who we get very little time with, to our actual main characters. And this is related to the first negative of not really engaging with Fee necessarily at the start. I actually did prefer the side characters, even though their story felt very much like it was unrelated at the start. So that was definitely a negative to me. A big positive as we continue through the series is that this seems to improve. Book two helps me to engage with our main characters a lot better. I felt much more ride and die with them. I felt much more like they were people I was rooting for and I liked. Along with that, one of the biggest positives I can say about this trilogy is the world building. The world that Dyrk Ashton has created is super interesting. Now, this is a big positive if you are a fan of mythology, if you like myths from different cultures, if you like religions and how they've affected different cultures, and how they feed into each other. I think this series is for you. It is incredibly well researched, it is broad and it is deep in terms of how it uses those things as its fantastical elements. It very much feels like this world is completely our world, and it makes sense, all these characters and where they've come from and how they fit into the mythology and the religions of the world, our world. And that is really awesome. It's the thing that really encouraged me to continue reading after what I thought was a relatively weak book one. My third and final negative is going to be for you if you hate info dumps. I don't mind info dumps. I actually found the info dumps in this series lessened towards the end of it. And I actually found them relatively interesting when they were there. They felt a little bit like encyclopedia entries, like just sort of telling us a chunk about the world. I didn't mind them because I thought they were interesting. I thought that the world was so interesting that I actually really didn't have a massive problem with them. However, if you are someone who really hates info dumps, you are going to struggle in the first half of this series. Okay, the first half of the series does like to info dump a lot of information on you at once, and it is really just world building, and that is definitely a struggle early on if you don't like that. I felt the world that Dyrk Ashton was creating compensated for that adequately and was interesting and well realised enough that I didn't actually mind it too much at all. My third and final positive for this series that I'm going to give you is that it is incredible towards the end. So I will say that Ashton sticks the landing admirably. I think the final book and the way he concludes and wraps up this trilogy is incredible. Obviously, there will be no spoilers here, but I think he definitely sticks the landing. I really enjoyed it. I think it all made sense. And actually, even the things I didn't like, so things like the third-person omniscient narrator, actually got explained, and I understood why he used that in a way that made me enjoy it more upon reflection. So if I do reread this series at some point, which I possibly will, I think I will enjoy that style of narration much more than I did on my initial read through, because it seems to make sense and there is a good understanding as to why it happened and why it was being told in that manner. The other thing with the ending here for this trilogy is that it becomes absolutely epic. So if you want to see stakes raised, if you want to see how an urban fantasy setting, which often can be lower stakes, can evolve into what is essentially an epic fantasy, but set in our world, this is an incredible example of that. I think it escalates incredibly well, the stakes are raised very well, and Dyrk Ashton does an incredible job of making these characters work and their motives clear, and the final confrontation we get is just really well done, well written, and even the falling action I think he absolutely nails. I think you can really see the step up in quality that Dyrk Ashton has as a writer. If you read book one and then you compare that to book three, it's a world of difference, okay? I think his writing in book three is incredible and much improved from book one specifically, but even from book two there seems to be a bit of a jump. And I think that's an incredibly big compliment to this series, is how much there is clearly growth in the author as he writes this series, as he continues on with it. So in conclusion, if you really hate info dumps, this might not be for you. If you need a really strong initial introduction into the series, this also might not be for you. If, however, you really want a interesting, well-realised, well-researched urban fantasy setting, you should definitely pick this up. And I'd say as well, if you want to see a series where someone makes the stakes huge and epic and sticks the landing, this is definitely going to be a series for you. Also, on a practical note, if you are an audiobook reader or an audiobook listener, you can pick up the entire trilogy as one book on Audible, and that will cost you 1 credit. So that's 60 hours worth of book for 1 single credit. I think if this sounds interesting to you at all, that is an incredible deal and you should definitely have a look at it. I hope that helps. I hope that gives you some pros and cons to this series and helps you consider whether you want to pick it up or not. If you like this video, don't forget to like, click the subscribe button, and I will see you again soon.